study session of the Lakewood City Council for Monday, November 9th to order. The first item we have for discussion is the joint meeting with the Community Services Advisory Board, which will kind of blend into the Human Service funding recommendations. So if we'll queue up, I guess it is Chair Yamamoto.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good evening, Mayor Anderson, Deputy Mayor Whalen, and council members. My name is Sarah Yamamoto, and I am this year's Community Services Advisory Board Chair. Been on the board for 2 years now, grew up in Lakewood, and looks like we also have board members Deanne Harris, Michael Lackady, and Edith Owen-Wallace on call this time as well. Our goal tonight is to update you on the progress of our 2020 work plan. We asked for our joint session to coincide with the Human Services Coordinator's report on our 2021 funding recommendations because there is a lot of overlap. As you can see from the works accomplished document included in your packet, our 2020 work plan included working with the Community Development Department to approve the 5-year consolidated plan, approve the 2019 CAPER, conduct a hearing on community development and housing needs, and develop 2021 CDBG and home funding strategies, as well as working with the Human Services Department to oversee the 2020 Human Services contract performances, to review and approve the 2021 application material and process, and to develop recommendations for 2021 Human Services funding. Due to the effects of COVID-19, we did not work on the community development work plan items and instead focused on the human services goals in the work plan. This board's most significant outcomes this year include conducting a meeting with the Lakewood's Promise Advisory Board to develop a joint recommendation for human services funding strategies, overseeing the 2020 Human Services contract performances and CARES funding strategies, reviewing and approving the human services application, rating criteria, and timeline for 2021 applications, and most significantly, rating human services applications, interviewing all 26 applying organizations, and deliberating to reach a consensus on our recommendations for 2021 human services funding. Throughout this process, we tried to think deeply about the needs of the Lakewood community and weighed many factors. We know there's a housing affordability crisis and a homelessness problem. There's a lot of concern regarding youth mental health. We reviewed the application and rating materials to ensure we're asking applicants about their impact and not just their outcomes. We increased the points available for organizations who demonstrate a strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We increased points available for programs that primarily serve Lakewood residents. And we took into consideration how program delivery has been affected by COVID-19. Above all, we maintained a commitment to a fair, straightforward, competitive process and made our recommendations based on the strength of the applications and interviews. Finally, we would like to thank the Council for your continuing commitment to provide funding for Lakewood's critical social service organizations. Not all the organizations scored highly in this process, but they are all doing great work under extraordinary circumstances. Thank you. Open to any questions you have.
Questions from Council? Let's see. I'm scanning the control board here. So what questions do you have for us going forward for the next year?
The main question we would have would just be consistency of available funding, especially given all the volatility with COVID and everything that's going on, just so we know what to expect moving forward.
I don't know that there is a decision made yet. There is has been some discussion, frankly, of carving something out, council carving something out and allocating that. But no decision has been made, at least not when I was there.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Brandstetter.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really wanted to ask regarding your efforts to determine applicants' commitment to equity and inclusion. And I know that was included on the application, and they provided a narrative. But, you know, how helpful was asking the question and getting a narrative, because some of the narratives seem very, very similar on the applications. And is there a better way to assess actual effort as opposed to just what folks put in writing?
Thank you, Mr. Brandstetter. I think, okay, Michael, do you want to take that one?
Michael, you are muted.
Unmute.
There you go.
Okay. I think the answer to that is when Brian goes out and checks with these organizations to make sure that they're living up to what they've stated in their applications. There's no other way, I don't think, to ask that question to get a more definitive response other than to go and check and see if they're living up to what they said they're going to do, you know?
I would also add that for a measure that's a little bit less qualitative, it's also helpful when organizations respond with how many of their board members or those in leadership position they identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or otherwise underserved populations. So we can see how that membership is informing the decisions made by organizations.
Well, thank you. I guess that in response to your question about next year, I'd ask that perhaps you considered at least doing some effort to assure ourselves that we are spending our human services dollars in a way that is appropriate through a equity and inclusion lens.
Thank you. Appreciate the call out.
Any other questions? Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sarah, you mentioned youth mental health. Do you have a plan or an idea of how what you plan to do in that area?
Thank you, Ms. Moss. We identified several organizations that applied with programs focusing on youth mental health, and I'm scrolling through my notes right here. So if someone else on the board wants to jump in, that would be great too.
So you're looking at working with organizations?
Yes, that's correct.
Have you identified any?
Yes. Let's see, I think.
Sarah, do you mind if I make a comment?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I don't think we've solicited any different organizations to work with youth mental health than with the applications that were provided. And in those applications, there was mention of and work around mental health, especially with the rise of COVID and mental health in general, but really focusing on the youth and not having that connection of their social connections of being in classrooms and brick and mortar schools and what impact that's making, not just on those youth, but the ripple effect on their families. And so a lot of the organizations, many of the organizations that submitted applications talked about the importance of identifying and providing that wraparound holistic approach to youth and their families with the increase of mental health, dealing with the current situation, what we're going through.
I understand that is quite a challenge right now. So there'll be more others working toward helping with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Ms. Farmer.
I wanted to really give a shout out to this group as the city council liaison. I've just been impressed by every single member's passion and interest in making sure that no stone is left unturned, and it was just there were a lot of heart-wrenching decisions. So many people need help. There are so many aspects that, you know, if you could just give a little boost, or if you could give a lot of money to get something over the finish line, and how can you possibly choose? And so this group just had some amazing conversations and really gave it their all. And I wanted to give them a shout out.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would just like to make a comment regarding this. I think next year is going to be the year that we're going to be able to see much more of an emphasis and a need for mental health for kids, particularly when they've been out of school and it's been so fragmented and there's been that no connection with anything. And I think that's going to be something that's going to kind of hit us between the eyeballs.
Yeah, I think that society-wide, we're seeing a bit of that now, and it's only going to accelerate. Much to the chagrin of my longtime teacher wife, I've always said that the first 6 years of education are 4 years of subject matter and 6 years of socialization.
Right.
There are gaps, and people advance at different stages, and they're losing a whole year of socialization.
I totally agree with you, Mayor. I have 4 teachers of varying levels in my family, and exactly the same thing of what you just said, and everybody's becoming more aware of it, is the socialization, the lack of trust, the lack of communication, the lack of a community of a place to belong.
However, we can't act until we get applications. So we have to encourage people who are involved in that environment to put in the applications so we can consider them. You know,
Right.
we can't go out and give money if we don't have a piece of paper in front of us.
Very true.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michael, and I think that's going to be something for us to really look at in making sure that we get that included in a pretty concrete, succinct way, so they know exactly what we're talking about.
So it's probably a good segue to move to Brian Humphreys for the outline of your recommendations. The people who did send in applications.
Okay.
So this is where we bow out, right?
No, I'd like you to stay around if you could.
Oh, that's not the instructions we got, but okay.
Okay.
They're gonna let us
Well,
stay?
It's 2020. We're being highly flexible about everything. We moved online. We're going to stay online.
I
All right. Well,
I have the gavel, and these are your recommendations. I think you should be on board. And in the past, actually, the committee has come forward with the recommendations. And
great. Sneakily, this is why I wanted them combined, so you would be tempted to keep them here. That's great. All right. Well, my turn then. Thank you, Council, for your time. You just heard from the Community Services Advisory Board. And I will try not to repeat anything they just went over, but my job, as you just mentioned, is to present their recommendations how to allocate 2021 human services funding based on the current estimate of how much will be available. In the, just to review their work, and while they're here, I'll just commend them. This was a tremendous amount of work this year and a tremendous amount of adjusting on the fly, moving everything online and having to adjust based on COVID, the applications and the application process. Everything about the process went virtual. Figuring out how to do the interviews virtually and getting everybody to do that was a tremendous amount of work and patience on their part. So this went a lot easier because they were all very flexible. But in the winter and spring, the members reviewed the human services funding strategies, the application itself, the rating criteria, and the timeline, which we then presented in April and you approved in June. The human services application opened on July 6th. There was a virtual workshop conducted July 15th, and applications were due on August 22nd. We received 26 applications totaling $539,480. I conducted a rating and review training for the advisory board in September. We conducted virtual interviews with all the applicants over 2 evenings on September 22nd, 23rd, and last month we convened for our deliberation meeting, developed tonight's recommendations. There is more detail in the memo included in your packet about the deliberations process, but broadly, the board tried to recommend full funding or close to it for the applications that scored the highest. They identified the organizations that scored low enough to not be recommended to receive funding, and they wrote justification statements for that decision. And then they tried to provide 70 to 80% of funding for as many additional programs as they could. In your packet, the attachments, I'm mainly going to focus on attachment B. But quickly, attachment A is the actual document we used for the deliberations process. So you can see the average scores out of 40 points and the justification statements for the programs that are not being recommended. Attachment C, we thought you would want to see the applicants' answers about who received CARES funding for 2020. I was going to separate out the amounts received in a separate column, but I realized the amounts are hard to compare. Some organizations received funds from a city or 2 cities or a city and a county or the whole state. And so it was apples to oranges. I just copied and pasted whatever answer they gave us. Attachment D, you've seen from me many, many times. It is the summary of the 6 bienniums of who has received funding. I'll share my screen for a minute and show you, we can look at attachment B together. So these are the programs sorted by funding strategy with this board's recommendations for funding. You will notice that, zoom in for a second here. You'll notice that the emotional supports and youth programming is being recommended for $125,000, approximately 33% of the total available. Housing assistance and homelessness prevention is at $40,000, about 11%. Crisis stabilization and advocacy, $68,000, about 18%. Health and behavioral health, $41,500, about 11%, and access to food is $105,000, about 27% of the total. I will say the first thing I did when I tallied these scores was email the board and tell them or let them know that they tended to score youth and food programs highly, and homelessness prevention and workforce development scored low, which is a priority for the city and Lakewood's promise. There seem to be a few reasons for that, but we talked about this, and the advisory board believes it is not their place to arbitrarily decide what is best for Lakewood over and above this process they developed. They decided their responsibility is to make recommendations to you based on the strength of the applications and the interviews alone as best they can. And then it would be for you all to make any necessary adjustments from there. And just to answer a couple questions that were asked, I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. The youth organizations would tell you that one of the best mental health interventions for youth is play and leadership development and mentorship. And so all of the youth programs that we support are youth mental health programs, and they certainly would say that. And there are specific mental health activities and mentorship activities embedded in a lot of those youth programs. And the commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, definitely something we would like to ask and draw out more answers, although there was more dynamic answering of that in the interviews. And really the entire application emphasizes the organization's commitment to Lakewood residents, and that commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion really comes throughout, not just in the DEI question, but throughout the application. We get a sense of that, hopefully accurately. But all right, that's all I had planned, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have about the process or the recommendations themselves.
Questions from council? So I see at least one, I think, new recipient, Springbrook Connections. Are there others that were recommended for funding that are new to our process?
Tillicum Community Center hasn't been funded in a while. Of the ones being recommended, Making a Difference Foundation is not someone we have funded before. I think those are the only brand new ones.
So I'm familiar with them. Springbrook Connections is a newly formed entity, and I'm not confident that it has 501c3 status yet. In fact, I checked the IRS, but IRS, because of COVID, isn't up to date like it normally is, but they aren't on the list of 501c3s published by the IRS. That was cut off last spring sometime with COVID, as far as the updates go. And so I think it's important that we confirm that. And likewise with the Tillicum Community Center, they defaulted on their agreement with Pierce County with respect to the building. They nearly dissolved. They were administratively dissolved as a corporation. They lost their 501c3 status and they suffered a major embezzlement. What have we done to validate that those circumstances have been corrected?
We haven't validated those circumstances. I validated the information and the documents that Tillicum Community Center provided, and they have not been very responsive, so I couldn't get a lot more information out of them. I got those documents, the backup documentation, essentially the day before the application happened. So they've not been very communicative. We knew that was a challenge in the past, but we also figured that was a little bit more of the council's decision rather than us to decide whether that disqualifies them or not. Springbrook Connections, I'm pretty confident, I'll verify this, I'm pretty confident they either have or are about to establish a fiscal sponsorship relationship with the 501c3 organization while they're getting their own. So I think that's taken care of, but I would verify that.
Okay, well, yeah, that would be my suggestion, that at least coming into it, that they get kind of a fiscal agent that is a 501c3 to phase in. Sometimes it's a little difficult. And sometimes newer, smaller organizations think that once they're incorporated as a nonprofit with the state, they are a 501c3. And of course, that isn't correct. But I am still concerned about Tillicum Community Center as a successor. Maybe it's somebody that's reincorporated. I just don't know. It's not necessarily that there's something bad with the program. It's that we had a problem in the past, and I had heard at the time that the only reason the county didn't take the building back under the CDBG covenants was they didn't want the mess that had been created. So I think we need to do some checking there.
Okay. Yeah, I try not to do any additional pushing of buttons outside of our process, but if you'd like me to do more due diligence on that, I would be happy to.
Yeah,
There is another group.
That's a staff function, not a council function to do the due diligence. So I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions on the following up on Edith's comments about needs for youth. I applaud the allocation toward emotional supports and youth programming. My question is, did we get any sort of feedback from the school district as to which provider might assist and provide some of the services they hope to have for their students in need? Do we think Communities and Schools Lakewood will be the one to do that, or?
That's why Communities and Schools was the highest graded application, and they're the only ones that received 25,000, are being recommended for 25,000 for that reason, because they're not just doing youth programming, they are providing a lot of basic services for youth in the school district. So yeah, that was a priority.
And I as I indicated, I think the weighting toward youth supports and programming is a good one. So I think kudos to all of you on that. My next question is on the housing assistance and homelessness prevention. With LAHSA at 25 requested, 0 recommended. I'd like to get a little bit of the flavor behind that, because as you may know, we are seeking significant support from the legislature in terms of helping to expand LAHSA's facilities. So it begs the question, if we're not comfortable with their application for housing assistance and homelessness prevention, why are we looking to get $500,000 from the legislature for additional facilities? So tell me about their application and why it didn't get funded.
I'll let the rest of you take a chance if they read the application if you want to. I'm happy to answer, but I'll let you all take a shot at it if you want.
So I could start us off. The application wasn't written very strongly to support. I mean, yes, they're based out of Lakewood. They want to help with rental assistance. I mean, they are right in the backyard, but I had a sense personally, very disorganized, not everything running as smoothly as it could be. Mm-hmm. When we had the Zoom meeting with her, just very, she's got a lot going on. It just seems not a lot of focus. The heart is there, and I think that the mission is there. It's just I don't think they are necessarily functioning at the level that they could be. And been around in the community long enough per se, that they just, to me, should be at a different level. And it just was not a strong application. The interview that we did just was not a strong interview. So to me, that's why it scored as low as it did. And we had that discussion not to fund, unfortunately.
You know, there's several of these applicants that didn't show up for the interview. And, you know, I mean, here you are, you know, asking for, you know, $25,000, $20,000, $15,000, and you can't spare 10 minutes to get on a Zoom and plead your case. And to be honest with you, that plus, you know, the professionalism of the application comes into effect. We may sit here and say, we know this organization really needs the money more than this one, but we have to evaluate based on the application. That's the only thing we have to go on.
One of the other things we were balancing in our discussions as a board is, so I mentioned kind of in the introduction, the distinction between outcomes and impacts. And our understanding of what council is looking for is they're looking for more root causes. How are we moving the needle on these issues? And I think in that sense, we weren't seeing those results from LAHSA. I think LAHSA does a lot of great work with immediate needs and addressing what clients need in the moment. I wouldn't want our low score to not really honor that work. And I think it's just two different ways of looking at the situation.
Right. No, I appreciate all of your comments, and it was meant in the spirit of this collaborative discussion we're having, because this is good impact and input for us. And this is more of a comment for council generally based on your good input. You know, we get a little bit of heat in Lakewood for the lack of sufficient transitional housing. And we put some resources into LAHSA, and we're looking to invest more. And I think we as a council have to decide before we invest more and push for more and put our brand on the line and asking for more, we need to make sure that there is an adequate infrastructure in place for them to receive it and apply it well. And I'm concerned about that. So I appreciate your input, because we all want to do the right thing and we know there's a need. We just got to make sure that there's an infrastructure there to accommodate and implement and execute on the resources to address the need. And I'm concerned about that. Thank you. Brian, did you have anything else to add?
Well, only that even if LAHSA were the best homelessness prevention organization in the country, there's a fundamental problem they can't fix, which is transitional housing only works if there is affordable housing for someone to transition to when you get them a living wage job, which is why we're talking so much about workforce development. None of this matters if people are not finding a way to earn $20, $24 or more dollars an hour. So when we have that answer, we can actually talk about transitional housing. LAHSA will be the first one to tell you, we would love to transition these families out. What's a family earning $14 an hour supposed to do in Lakewood right now? So how do we get them higher wages? And they're struggling with that. So they could do better. We all could be doing better. But and there's a difference between how we allocate money within the city. Well, you know, this funding could go to this excellent youth program that's serving you. Like you could go to communities and schools or LAHSA. That's a choice. But if we're talking about money coming in for transitional housing, that's not going to go to communities and schools. It's not going to go to YMCA. I mean, LAHSA is our partner on that. And so we're kind of hoping for the best from them. And let's bring as many resources as we can for transitional housing. But it's a risk no matter what they're doing.
Right. Okay.
Right, Mr. Branstetter.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, you know, I appreciate the discussion about LAHSA's application, and I can readily see where they come across as very busy and doing a lot of things. But I guess that in respect to the deputy mayor's concern about how does this appear, we're asking for $500,000 to expand their transitional housing facility, that this application that they submitted to you was not for that. It was a utility assistance program, which I'm not, you know, so concerned that we need to have another provider, since there are a good number of folks of ways through the county and through the various utilities, that is already to be accomplished. So it wasn't way up on my need chart of needs that weren't being met. And I don't think that not funding them for that purpose is impactful in terms of assessing whether we look for them to be essentially a landlord of more transitional housing units than they are now.
Mayor Anderson, you asked if there was any,
Yep.
if there was anybody,
You're back.
you had asked if there was any new applications for the first time. And there is one that we didn't mention. Your Money Matters Monitoring, I think is their first time that they've applied. Isn't that right, Brian?
Yes, but we're not recommending that for funding at this time, but they're a new application, yeah.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question, I noticed in the Exhibit A and sometimes in the comments and impacts of work already being done in Lakewood not clear enough, and under one of the ones that was rejected. But in all of them, how do you go about determining how many people in Lakewood are impacted?
Well, I'd say that's Edith, go ahead.
I was just going to say, often in the report and the request and the funding request that's given to us, they will announce or they will tell us the percentage or how many. And then we also do some counting to make sure, and we ask them questions. So I'm very comfortable with the fact that it's a pretty fair, reasonable distribution without a lot of deep pockets, if you will. It's more even across, but they're very aware that we're looking very carefully at making sure this is for Lakewood people.
Yeah, we asked number of Lakewood residents served and percentage of the total that Lakewood residents make up, so we can determine whether it's just a small fraction or not. This is actually where Your Money Matters kind of fell down and became not recommended, is because I kind of feel sorry for them because they got grilled by the panel on this point in particular. Tell us exactly how many Lakewood residents are going to get served and exactly what our funding is going to go towards. They didn't get a clear answer, and that was that's why that we have that result.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I think you did a good job in a very difficult circumstance. I look at the amount requested was nearly 560,000, and you had 380 to work with. And according to my calculations, and I'm kidding you that they're not my calculations, I pulled it out my calculator. It's about 67%. So a third of the thing, couldn't be funded. And so it's always a difficult situation. And I'm sure because you actually get to meet the people this year, not in person, and you get to talk to them about and there's a lot of good causes on here, right? There's a lot of good organizations on here. So I appreciate you making those tough calls. I really do. Because they're not easy and they would be hard for us to do, quite frankly. So I appreciate your time and your efforts on this. I think you did a good job.
Anyone else? Ms.
I was just going to respond to his comment and say, there's enough of us that are out and about and have diversified lifestyles that we hear and we see things that really help to give us some insight and information that we can help to make decisions like these tough ones. And remember, Lakewood's not that big. Big enough, but not that big. Sorry, Mr. Council Member.
Mr. Whalen.
I just had a follow-up question, Brian, and to the group. You know, with regard to the allocation, I'm on board with your recommendations. You guys have done yeoman's work on all of this, but if we get asked about what is Lakewood doing for housing assistance and homelessness prevention, if you had a magic wand, what do you think is the gap that we have in Lakewood to more adequately serve you know, the housing and homelessness needs in Lakewood, other than a rising economic boat, Brian, which I agree with you would be a wonderful thing, but it doesn't happen obviously overnight to create more living wage jobs. It's a long process we have to work on together. But what are the gaps that if we had more funding that could be filled in this area? Because we're going to get asked about it. So
we've talked about this at some length, and unfortunately, I think we've come to the conclusion, unless you can give us like $100 million, there's no way that we're going to solve it.
Right.
The paucity of funds that we have to distribute for that effort,
Mm-hmm.
really, I don't think any of us could come up with some magic idea on how we're going to solve it.
Right.
No, it's not something that we've ignored. It's something that we sit there and
No.
look at each other.
I'm not suggesting that you guys have. It's a community issue. It's not your problem or our problem. It's a community issue. I'm just gleaning your expertise from sitting in on the application process.
Yeah, go ahead, Edith.
I was just going to say, and I think we spend time looking at those things that are either coming or have a long history, and for some reason don't meet the profile for funding, that we are very aware that those things are out there, like our GBTL, our gay and lesbian kids and all those things, very aware that that's there. Thanks, Deanne. Go ahead.
And I think some of it has to do with the organizations that are providing those services as well. I mean, it's not just a one lane into the issue. We have a huge population working poor that don't qualify for services, that are a paycheck away from losing their house and don't have the resources that they need to be able to, provide for their families because they are making above that threshold. If the federal poverty level was increased, and some agencies have that flexibility to say we are asking for an exemption, or we are asking for us to be able to have this percentage of poverty level, we can serve more people. Organizations also have a one-time, you can come in and get rental assistance one time and then we can't help you. Well, there's not another agency for that. And they do that to protect funding. I completely understand. I'm a social worker by trade, and I understand the impact of going into the food bank or going into a social services agency and only being able to access services once with no other backup. So it's a systematic, but it's a community program agency concern and issue as well. You have to be flexible enough with the funding that you receive to be able to help a larger scale of people. So it's about restructuring on how you can provide those services. So I don't think there's a golden answer or a golden ticket of this is going to solve it, because it's going to take a lot of people at the table to say, okay, we need to build in flexibility to help people. We have people living on the benefit cliff that won't go get full-time work because they have that security of, I know when my TANF check's going to be here. I know when my food stamps are going to get here. If I start working above this threshold, I start losing some of those benefits. So I just make that minimum so I can still access services like rental assistance or utility assistance. But then when they do go over that benefit cliff and they start to make enough money to quote unquote survive, they lose all those benefits. And now when their check is short or they need assistance, they can't access it because they don't qualify. So it's a multifaceted issue. And so it's going to take a lot of people at the table from organizations that really want to put the work in and look at the big picture, because it's not about, and I've heard the mayor and council say, we don't want to put a Band-Aid on this. We want to make an impact. We want long-term. There needs to be a collaboration and a work group created with all these organizations so you can really see how you can partner and strengthen that to provide more holistic wraparound services. And that's off my soapbox, sorry.
No, it's very, very helpful.
Yeah,
And thank you.
And the city manager forwarded you a document today, something that you and I were talking about last week. But this is what I've been using the community collaboration the last few meetings to crowdsource about. Is we know that workforce development is our best strategy if we do it well to get incomes up to afford the housing that we have. But as you said, the timeline for an effective, even the best workforce development strategy is much longer than the kind of short-term emergencies we see coming, especially with the end of the eviction moratorium. And the only real valuable thing that we might do in the shorter term is increased capacity of financial coaching, in part because we do see a lot of households figuring that calculus out in their brain. Oh, there's a moratorium. Maybe I just won't pay my rent for 9 months, pocket the money, and then I'll get evicted. I mean, and we even, community development and I've been talking, that's a terrible strategy. They don't understand what's going to happen to them on the back end of that decision. So it's partly helping households understand the wisdom of that, but also helping understand households say the resources that you do have just have to stretch farther so you do not become homeless while we're working on a workforce development strategy. So the workforce development strategy has evolved into a Center for Strong Families conversation so we can increase financial coaching and workforce development capacity simultaneously.
That's great. That's very helpful.
Totally.
Yeah, there's got to be a better way to break the poverty generation because, I'm a workforce development programs manager for a nonprofit. And so I completely, agree with what Brian's saying. We need to be able to get people engaged in training. We need to get people living wages. We need to get people at that level so they can maintain that and get affordable housing. It's going to take a lot of people at the table to make that happen.
Well, we're not going to solve that tonight, I don't think. But we really do appreciate all the hard work that you've put in coming up with recommendations for the limited funds that we have. I've long subscribed to the mantra that economics is applying limited resources to unlimited need. And that's a real tough job. And you have done yeoman's work in coming up with these recommendations. We greatly appreciate your efforts, and we'll double your pay for next year, just like we did last year.
Yeah.
So thanks again, and we'll consider those when they come back up on the agenda. And I'm sure that your input is going to be the most valuable part of that decision-making process. So thanks again. Good evening. And we will move on to lodging tax funding allocations.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
With Assistant City Manager Todd Kraus.
Am I on? I'm sorry, okay.
Yes.
Okay, so in early August, the city solicited and received 15 proposals requesting $605,400 plus the $101,850 for the McGavick Center commitment, for a total request of $707,250. The Lodging Tax Committee met in mid-September to hear presentations by each applicant, and after deliberation recommended allocations totaling $672,250. Of all the applicants, the three received less than their request. That was Lakewood Gardens had requested $60,000. The recommendation is $50,000. Lakewood Farmers Market requested $50,000 and received a recommendation of $35,000. And Lakewood Imaging Promotions requested $50,000 and the recommendation is $40,000. The reason for the reductions in the recommendations has to do with the overnight stays. And the committee just did not feel that with these three that the hotel stays would be at the level that would generate a lot. So this item will be before the City Council on November 16th for approval. And at that time, the City Council may accept or reject any of the lodging tax funding recommendations or return the recommendations to the Lodging Tax Committee for further consideration. And under this alternative, the City Council would need to provide direction as to what it desires from the committee. And third, the City Council could decline to take action on some but all of the proposed recommendations. However, the commitment for the McGavick Center would still be intact. So that concludes my presentation.
I would also note that the funding level was not as stressed by COVID as we would probably initially have expected. So we should be in decent shape for next year. And another consideration that was taken into account, fairly significant one, was what the funding level was in prior years, especially last year. And so some of the tempering of the requests had to do with the magnitude of the requested increase. Any questions? Seeing none, well, Ms. Kraus, you're on the agenda for the next several items, so please move on to accounts receivable write-offs.
Okay, for the accounts receivable write-offs, the city has made reasonable attempts to collect any outstanding receivables. Such attempts have failed and at least 120 days have passed since the original due date and the receivables have been sent to collections. Also, 24 months has passed since the original due date. The accounts receivable write-off proposed totals $35,900.17. This item will be coming before the City Council on November 16th for approval. And that concludes my presentation.
Any questions?
I do have one.
Mr. Whalen.
I had a quick question on the David Schooley subrogation for the $25,952 item. So my only confusion on that was this gentleman's vehicle damaged a contractor's equipment truck, a truck mounted attenuator. So how did that become the city's problem?
So this wasn't a piece of equipment that was struck by a civilian traveling on Interstate 5. The equipment was damaged, is a truck mounted, like you said, the attenuator. The incident occurred during the nighttime hours during a normal takedown of traffic control. The city was required to reimburse the contractor in accordance with the contract for all time and materials required to repair the device. So it's in accordance with our contract.
So we had to repair their equipment that was damaged on the job due
Yes.
to a third party not in the control of the city.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay.
So the question would be, how does that provision get into a contract?
Mm-hmm.
If this starts out with our contract template. Ms. Wachter? Put you on the spot.
Yes, and I would have to go back and look at the contract and find out whether it is a standard provision or something this particular contractor requested. And I will tell you that while we frequently run our contract language by our insurer and get other sets of eyes on it, one of the things that they frequently tell us is sometimes terms that get into contracts are there because we're dealing with a particular provider or a particular price point that we would prefer. I don't know whether that was the case here or whether this was even a point that anyone particularly noticed, but I can certainly go and look at the contract and what the situation was and get back with the council on that.
Because it seems like a logical extension of that is if we hire a contractor and they leave a generator out and somebody steals it during the night, that they'd come to us and say, well, that was something that was lost on the job due to a third party. You owe us for it. So.
Well, and I can certainly tell you that typically when we hire contractors, they are sort of on their own for their own materials to perform the job with and those sorts of things. And it is expected that they would be responsible for those items. But I will find out what happened in this particular case.
Maybe a weird indemnity, a hold harmless thing. I don't know. But...
Yes, and we do occasionally go back and forth on indemnification language. Sometimes, as I said, in the larger picture of what we're trying to get in terms of services or price, we don't hold the line as hard as we might. I don't know that that's what happened in this case, or if it was simply that we didn't look that closely at the language, but I'll take another look at it.
And I have to commend you on your initial first sentence answer, because I don't know how many times in 35 plus years of law practice I told a client who called on the phone, I'd have to see the contract and read it to tell you.
Yes, the contract questions really do get very specific. So I will go take a look at it though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, Ms. Kraus. The next item is a review of the 2021 fee schedule amendments.
Okay, so on an annual basis, the proposed fee schedule for the upcoming year is presented to the City Council for consideration and approval. The proposed changes affect 6 different parts of the current fee schedule. Part A, copies and duplications, amendments to Part C, the planning and development fees, amendments to Part D, general requirements for construction-related permits, amendments to Part 5, public works permit fees, and amendments to Part G, parks and recreation programs, and lastly, amendments to small cell wireless facilities. In the packet, there's a track changes version with background information on why these were proposed. Additionally, there's a clean version so the City Council could see what these would look like if the fee amendments were presented, passed as presented. Additionally, there was an email by the city manager with some follow-up answers to some questions that council had. And that really concludes my presentation. This item is coming to the City Council on November 16th for adoption.
Questions from Ms. Kraus? Seeing none, we move on to a review of the 6-year 2020-2026 financial forecast. Again, Ms. Kraus.
So this financial forecast was prepared under the uncertainty of COVID-19 pandemic. So it's really a reflection of what was our current economic conditions at the time it was prepared. As the economy stabilizes, I'll be preparing a more comprehensive update to the forecast. The revenue projections currently are based on a 5-year trend and takes into consideration and adjust these trends accordingly. They're projected conservatively in accordance with our financial policies, and revenue growth will not be recognized until after it takes place. Expenditures are based on a general 3% increase with adjustments for known and anticipated increases, and does not include limited term positions with end dates of December 31st, 2022, and also does not include positions that are authorized yet funded in the 21 and 22 biennial budget. Excuse me. So other than step increases, the forecast does not include other potential adjustments such as wage increases beyond the current contract period. We have several collective bargaining agreements that have expired or are set to expire, which include the LPIG, which expired on December 2020, or will be expiring on December 2020. And then we have ASME and the Teamsters, which will expire next year. And then the one that is current is the Lakewood Management Police Guild, which doesn't expire until 2022. So the 6-year forecast assumes our local economy will be recovering from the pandemic in early 2022. So similar to what you have seen in previous forecasts, the general fund projects operating expenditures to exceed operating revenues beginning in 2023. And that's primarily caused by slower operating revenue growth and recovery compared to the operating expenditure growth. Projections in 2023 includes reinstating annual fleet and equipment reserves, as well as including information technology projects from the IT strategic plan. It also includes funding on an annual basis of $50,000 in support of SSMCP, $80,000 per year for Park CIP, $700,000 for transportation CIP, with the exception of 2026, which is $515,000 based on the current 6-year CIP, as well as $65,000 for public art on an annual basis. So looking into 2023 through 2026, we're looking at operating gap of $392,000 in 2023 and $767,000 in 2024. That continues to grow as revenues are not keeping up with operating expenditure growth. We're also looking at the ending fund balance reserves that are required, and in 2023, that's projected to be $1.5 million shortfall in the ending fund balance reserves. that grows to $3.4 million in 2024 and continues to grow in 25 and 2026. So really, this is just a kind of a snapshot projection during this COVID-19. And I will be updating this forecast as soon as we close out the year and we have more information on what our major revenues are looking like. So that concludes my presentation.
Questions from Ms. Kraus?
Well, I do have a question.
Mr. Whalen.
Just out of curiosity, and I appreciate the conservative approach to the financial policies for sure. But when I look at the projections for 23 through 26 for operating revenues, again, they're pretty darn conservative. And we usually end up having, at least it's been history here, that we've got these interim sort of budget tweaks that we do where, oh my gosh, REIT has exceeded expectations by X or whatever. So my question is, are those realistic? Conservative is one thing, but are they too conservative in that they reflect a much more significant shortfall than really might be realistic, I guess is my question. Because 1.9 to 2.0 for revenue increases year over year as we go out, 6 years, pretty meager, which does result in a pretty high shortfall.
I will agree with you that they are conservative. And again, this is just done at a time where we have the pandemic going on.
Mm-hmm.
In particularly to revenues that are supporting projects, for example, with the real estate excise tax. Yes, we are seeing revenues from real estate excise tax come in very strongly compared to what we have budgeted. And in the past few years, they have been very strong. However, those dollars, remember, are committed to projects. So if I budget or estimate, a much higher level and we've committed the dollars to capital projects, if those monies don't come in, where would we get the monies to continue supporting the contracts that are in place? So in that respect, it is very conservative, just because financial commitment to a specific project.
Right. I'm kind of surprised that gambling tax is estimated to be as high as it is based on our expectation this year. It got whacked pretty good.
Yeah, and actually gambling tax, as you're going to see in mid-December, is really coming in stronger than we had anticipated. And I think it's going to come in stronger in 2020 compared to what the year-end estimate is.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
So maybe I missed it in here. Do we have a projected reserve is going forward on these years?
I think you're breaking up, but I think what I heard is projected reserves in the out years. Is that correct? So our projected, so if we're looking at 12% projected reserves for the general fund, we should have about $5,027,000 or $5,028,000 in 2023. If we were to meet those reserve requirements per the financial policies, we would need $1,513,000 in 2023. In 2024, because operating revenues are not keeping in pace with expenditures, the deficit general fund balance, when taking into consideration the amount that we need for reserves, grows to $3,409,000.
What I'm asking though is, can we put in I guess it isn't here, could we put in a line that has what the projected reserves are and what that percentage is going forward? And then you click, and if revenues come in better, or you can play with it, say revenues are $200,000 more, and you put another $200,000 in it and flush through. I know how to get the numbers I'm talking about, and I have to do about 3 equations off this chart. Yeah, if you look at 2024, you'd have to say, okay, what was the calculate what was the deficit for 2023? What was the operating deficit for 2024? You put those together, you calculate what that is as what is left in the reserves is, well, first you calculate what 12% is, and what's left after you take those out as a percentage, and it'd be a lot simpler just to have in a cell down there.
Okay, sure. I can do that for the next forecast.
That'd be great. Because when you're looking 6 years, you know, some electeds look at how long they're going to be in office. Others look what's healthy for the city 5 or 6 years out. And sometimes it causes caution on the part of elected officials if they look at it, say their 12% reserve is turning into 3 unless we turn. Any other questions? Mr. Branstetter?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Kraus, I mean, just to make sure that I am understanding that in those years of where our reserves are going to fall below the 12%. And that's because revenues are projected conservatively to not match expenditures. And are expenditures estimated as conservatively as revenues, or are they, as the deputy mayor said, are expenditures reflected in this chart more realistically
than revenue?
I would say that both sides are conservative.
So you would say that the expenditures are on the low side?
The expenditures, well, there's a couple different ways to look at it. The expenditures could be on the higher side at 3% if contracts don't all increase, for example. However, there is also built in some increases for personal benefits, such as medical and such. So the 3% historically has been a weighted average of the increases that we're projecting. It could also not be very conservative. If you look at it in terms of, we have some collective bargaining agreements that are not factored in the outer years. So once those get settled, those will need to be added into the forecast.
Okay. But you're comfortable with the estimates for the upcoming biennium?
I'm comfortable. Are you talking for the 21 and 22? Yes, I'm comfortable with those estimates.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And Ms. Kraus, you still have the floor. Moving to the 20.
Mayor, I'm sorry.
Mr.
Mayor, John here. I was wondering if I could just add a comment, Mr. Mayor. Just 2 things real quick. First, I'd like to just echo Ms. Kraus's comment that this is a snapshot in time, and really it's driven by the COVID pandemic and the uncertainty that's out there. I think both Ms. Kraus and I are confident that when the economy does come back, we're beginning to see it kind of come roaring back in some sectors, but in other sectors it's not. But one of the things that we didn't do this time that we're going to do next time that we did last time is to develop different scenarios. Again, the purpose of this scenario is a snapshot in time because of COVID. But the next time we come back to you, we'll have 3 scenarios like we did last time. Kind of the 60% option, which is the most probable scenario, but then also have a scenario that operates outside of our financial forecast that takes into account, for example, economic development initiatives, if they were to come to fruition, to give the council an understanding of what the impact would be, particularly on our revenues. And then kind of a 10%, and that would be like the 30% probability. And then the 10% one would be, again, if something goes sideways and, something not so positive happens. So we want to bring that back. The second comment I'd like to make is that as we look out into the next biennium, the projected operating income losses of, 400,000, and then it's really $400,000 because then it doubles up into the next year and then it triples up and then quadruples up. So really the operating deficit is 400,000. And in the size of our budget, and again, based on our financial policies, that is something that is not, I don't lose sleep over that. I'm confident that as the economy improves and if we look out 2-3 years, that gap will be resolved one way or the other. Because if you think back to where we were 3 years ago, looking at our current biennial budget, we had actually a pretty deep hole, and we've been able to come back from that as well. So again, just wanted to leave you with those 2 comments. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further questions on that, we will now move along with Ms. Kraus to a review of the 2021-22 proposed biennial budget.
So at last week's public hearing, I noted changes to the original proposed budget as it relates to adding funding for the Lakewood Multicultural Coalition, as well as adding the TBD funds for transportation capital projects since the Supreme Court ruled I-976 as unconstitutional. Since then, there has been one more change related to municipal court. The current proposed budget includes a reduction in municipal court personnel to reflect the decrease in work volume with the elimination of the court contract with the City of University Place beginning January 1st, 2021. This change impacts 2 court compliance officers positions and 2 court clerk positions being reduced from 1.0 FTE to 0.80 FTE. However, with the recent and upcoming court clerk retirement, so instead of filling this position, we're proposing to return the 4 positions from 0.80 FTE to 1.0 FTE. This has 0 impact on the current proposed budget. The 2021 proposed budget will be coming before the City Council on November 16th for adoption. And that concludes my presentation.
My only question on that was doesn't it have a positive impact on the budget? If we have 4 people at 0.8 and 4 benefit packages, and we go to 3 people at 1.0 and have 3 benefit packages?
Not necessarily, because the reductions were not based on specific employees. They were just a percentage. And so if we were to go back to the 0.8 positions, it really depends on the collective bargaining and how that translates in who would have to go to 0.80 positions. So it would not necessarily be a positive impact. It could be close.
Yes, I still don't understand that. If you have, just on the base salary, if you have 0.8 times 4, you have 3.2.
It's actually looking at, when I did this, I did not have like the specific employees that would go to 0.80 positions. So if there are multiple people in those positions, it's taking a look at, if I were to do a 0.080 reduction, I selected like say the ones that were at the bottom of the scale or had the least cost and benefits. I'd have to go back and compare what it looks like with that position out. But the net impact is going to be minimal.
Okay. Under the collective bargaining agreement, it's likely that the people with the least seniority would take the biggest hit. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Ms. Kraus. You have dominated our agenda tonight.
Thank you.
So we now move to Coronavirus Relief Fund CARES Act grant funding status update with Ms. Spear.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Oops, here I am. One moment, please.
It's not easy being green.
And getting older and needing glasses. Thank you for your patience. Tiffany Spear, and I'm going to share my screen briefly to show you once again just the latest update on what's happening with the Coronavirus Relief Fund grant program. As I did last week, this is a brief table to summarize where we're at with disbursements and allocations. So far, out of the total amount, almost 2.25 million has been allocated to external recipients. On last Friday, we did a second special run for the recipients that we'd received all of the paperwork for to date. And so that has now gotten us to a 1.319 million dispersal amount. We will be doing additional dispersals in November, both regular and special check runs to be able to get everything out. And as of today, we are thinking we will be done with all of the disbursements by November 23rd. And so we will not need to do one more disbursement on the 30th. So as of the 3rd of November, the city has been reimbursed by Commerce for the money that the city has forwarded to external recipients within 3 different disbursements from Commerce, totaling a little over $1 million. And those disbursements did turn around very quickly. So as I mentioned last week, they had committed to doing it within 10 days of receipt, and I think they did it even faster than that. What you see here on the chart, though, is that based on where we sit today, there is only about $1,400 of completely unallocated funds, and we don't think there's going to be anyone else to come forward and ask for those dollars from the outside. One thing I wanted to bring to the council's attention, though, is that as of right now, there is this amount of money still to be sent out to external recipients based on their paperwork and grant approvals that's happened and been received. But there are 13 potential recipients that have not responded at all. They did their initial application and were approved, but they haven't done anything since, including executing a contract. And then there's also 26 executed contracts of various types where not all of the paperwork has been received despite multiple attempts by the city to reach out to these various entities and receive those documents. So we are working like crazy this week between now and Friday the 13th to complete all of that back and forth and identify the final list of those external recipients that will receive funds. They've been getting notified since last week that the 13th would be the final day. So we've basically given them 2 weeks to respond with this new drop dead date. And then on the 13th, once we see how many are not going to respond at all, the city will then be taking the remainder of the dollars, and as the council discussed earlier on, those funds will be allocated toward the eligible city costs. I won't try to take you through this list, but essentially this is the list that I'm mentioning where you've got either no contract at all or there's a contract, but there's still missing paperwork. LAHSA just submitted its first big request for reimbursement for its rental assistance today. So they will get that funding at the end of this week. But everything together that hasn't been paid because of missing paperwork, it's about $642,000. If you assume LAHSA will get all of their paperwork in by this Friday, it will be about $235,000 unless some of the others also submit their paperwork this week. And with that, I'll answer any questions you may have.
Questions for Ms. Spear? So has LAHSA received any reimbursement to date?
No, this was their first submittal of any paperwork today.
And that is for 400,000 plus, is that correct?
It's about 278,000. They were allocated 685 to begin with, and this was about a $278,000 request. So they have a little over 400,000 remaining to ask for reimbursement for this week.
And what do we anticipate that their request is going to be this week? The amount?
Oh, I think they'll be able to justify getting all of that money back or from the city. It's just a matter of them collecting the paperwork and submitting it to us.
Right. I was asking about this week, though. Do we know what? Do we expect this to trickle in, or is it going to come in? Is the big lump coming?
I am assuming that the big lump is going to come in 1 or 2 pieces by the end of this week.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you very much for bird dogging this. It's amazing how difficult it is to give away money.
Agreed. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So we now go to reports by the city manager. I believe my agenda is correct here.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. A few updates. A couple of weeks ago, the artist that we had hired to do the Colonial Plaza artwork, she decided to step aside. She didn't feel she was the right fit to complete that project. Had a conversation with her. We were playing phone tag back and forth for a while. I had a conversation with her on Friday. And in the end, again, she just didn't think she was the right person to do the project. You know, that was a $100,000 contract. We had only incurred $5,000 worth of expense, which was for the design of the contract that we paid her. So we own that. So right now what we're doing is we're looking at options and alternatives on how to move forward. And we will be back in front of you as part of your December 14th study session with some ideas and a recommendation on how to go about implementing that, including reaching out to see if there are other artists out there that will be able to pick up the ball and move forward on this initiative. Earlier today, myself and Shannon Kelly Fong, our senior policy analyst, we met with representatives of Sound Transit regarding the Point Defiance bypass route to give an update. First and foremost, and I know that they've communicated this to us before, is that what's driving their process of allowing Amtrak to resume passenger rail services through this corridor is safety and not schedule. And so they have a very, very deliberate process that they're going through. They have a two-phase process. Phase one includes first static testing along the rail line, which is the improvements that they've put in place, followed by some train runs to test those systems. Once that's done, they would then move to phase two. Phase two is actually where Amtrak would get up with their crews and begin training and running trains through that corridor. Right now, they are beginning to move into phase one and the static testing. And then the second part of that, again, would be what's called the dynamic testing, which is where they would have Sound Transit. They would run trains through the corridor. The soonest that would occur, as I mentioned, they were thinking that was going to occur in November. Actually, the soonest that would occur would be the middle to latter part of January of 2021 at the soonest, at the very, very soonest. Meaning that if this was driven by schedule, and again, you know, Sound Transit is being very, very deliberate on the training and the safety initiatives, that the soonest that passenger rail would be up and running in that bypass would be, you know, sometime in third or even early fourth quarter of 2021. So there's still a ways out on that. Also, one of the things that we had asked was for Sound Transit to look at the speed of the trains coming through that corridor, and 79 miles an hour, as I think you all are aware, we just think is too much. So Sound Transit has committed to looking at that, though the caveat is that if they do come to the conclusion that the speed can be reduced in that corridor, that's going to require concurrence from WashDOT Rail, Amtrak, as well as FRA, the Federal Rail Administration. But again, I really appreciate Sound Transit taking a look at that and doing what they can for our community to at least have slower trains coming through our community, particularly given that we're going to have 5 at-grade crossings. They also have a new chief security officer who they have brought on board. We had a chance, he's only been on the job for about a month. He had a very, very distinguished background and resume, working all over the country, as well as actually internationally as well. And so one of the things that we offered was to give him a tour so he can see really the challenges that we face given the at-grade crossings, as well as his team had mentioned that they wanted to get him out to look at the main gate at JBLM and the issue of the at-grade crossing there as well. So we're hoping that we can get him out here in the near future to again give him a tour of the landscape in terms of what we're facing. So again, long story short, the the soonest that Amtrak passenger service rail would be coming through there would be, the latter half of 2021 sometime. Also, we learned today, WashDOT, I think we had briefed you before, we had been asked to participate in the I-5 JBLM shared use path, which is the pathway that WashDOT, the bike pedestrian pathway that WashDOT was going to build fronting JBLM on I-5, connecting down from about the Steilacoom DuPont interchange, connecting up to about where Berkeley is. And, both JBLM and Sound Transit were not supportive of that. We had looked at an alternative, which is to have that shared pedestrian bike path go the back way, which would be from the Steilacoom DuPont Road, connecting to East Road, then connecting to what we call Northgate Road into Lakewood. Well, long story short, WashDOT has bought into that, and so they are going to be moving that route from the frontage of I-5 to that more localized one. And that's something that Lakewood, DuPont, Steilacoom, University Place, Pierce County, and JBLM all support. So really appreciate WashDOT stepping up and listening to our concerns and our issues there. On the state legislative front, the Senate released their plans for how they're going to conduct business, and generally speaking, it's going to be mostly virtual. The House has not released their plans for the coming session. However, what we're hearing is that it's going to be essentially, again, a completely remote session. We have identified December 2nd, 2020, which is a Wednesday, from 6 to 7:30 as an opportunity for you folks to have a joint meeting with the legislators from the 28th and the 29th district. We have 4 commitments, and we're waiting on 2 others to RSVP on that. But again, tentatively, we have scheduled that for Wednesday, December 2nd, and we hope to be able to finalize that in the near future. We also heard back from DSHS regarding the Western State Hospital Community Partnership Program. And we were pleased with the correspondence that we got back for them. However, our big concern is, since it's just kind of lumped into the DSHS budget, we're concerned that it might get lost in translation if there's some kind of an across the board reduction in budget. And so we're in the process of doing 2 things. One is that we're reaching out to the governor's policy advisor on behavioral health issues, just to again reemphasize our concerns that program is not subject to an across the board cut. And then also we plan on following up with a letter to the governor directly on that. Also, I think as you're aware, WashDOT was directed to put a pause on a number of projects, including easements and right-of-way acquisitions, and that actually impacts the Gravely Lake North Thorn Lane Connector Road project. However, WashDOT has initiated a process, and they're beginning to hold some virtual workshops to hear feedback and input on, if the legislature was to not cut projects, but what we're hearing, and I had a chance to talk with WashDOT leadership about 2 weeks ago, they're not looking at cutting projects, but rather pausing projects until the cash flow gets up and going again. And so we're going to have representatives from our Public Works Engineering Department, as well as the City Manager Department, participating in those virtual workshops as they occur between now and the end of December. And the purpose there is to advise the state legislature on kind of the ranking of current projects and whether or not projects should be paused or not paused. Just a reminder that our biannual cleanup for the fall is occurring this coming weekend on Saturday and Sunday. And we've got a couple of slots. We're looking for some volunteers. So if you're interested, let myself or the city clerk know, and we can get you out there. A key policy issue, and I'll let the mayor maybe get into more detail on this. But as you know, the mayor has been representing the council on the South Sound Housing Affordability Partners program, or SSHAP SHAPE. And they have come forward with a couple of funding alternatives for 2021 and 2022. And so just given the policy implications of that, we have placed that on your study session for your next study session meeting, which is November 23rd. And so probably more to follow on that. One of the things that I want to look at is also provide this body with funding options in terms of, whether CDBG monies could be used, or whether 1406 monies could be used, or, does it have to be general fund dollars or whatever. But I just wanted to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on that in advance of your study session, so we can have that information for you. Even though we're expecting kind of the current world to continue to exist into the early part of 2021, there are a number of areas that we're just continuing business as usual. And one of them is opening up the opportunity for nonprofit agencies to have access to the McGavick Conference Center as part of City Days. And so as we do every year, we have an advertisement period in the month of November, and then we go through a criteria ranking process that this body has provided us, and then we'll bring that back to the council and let you know what the outcome of that is in probably the middle part, or maybe the early part to middle part of December. Also, again, just a friendly reminder that the Fallen Officer Blood Drive is coming up on Thursday, November 19th, in conjunction with the food drive in remembrance of our fallen 4 officers. Also, the census 2020. So that has now been completed. I've heard some scuttlebutt that there's still some fighting in the courts, but as far as I know, it's done. And here in Lakewood, the self-response was almost 68%, which is actually very, very good. Overall, nationwide, the nation was at 67%, so we're a little bit better than the national average. However, we're a little bit below both the county and the state as a whole, which was about 72, 73%. However, a couple of areas we had significant increases in census reporting. One was in the Tillicum Woodbrook neighborhood, which had a response of almost 55%. And the reason I say that is because in 2010, it was at 28%. So almost doubled. And then in Springbrook, Springbrook had a responsive rate of 47%. However, in 2010, it was at 34%. So, the city was very proactively engaged in working with the Census Bureau and a number of city partners to try and get the word out, to get people to reply to the census. So we had some significant improvements. We wish it could have been better, but overall, I'm pleased with the results that we have here in Lakewood. And I'm confident, cautiously optimistic that we're going to have a more accurate count of the people who live here in Lakewood and call Lakewood home. So with that, Mayor, that's my report.
Questions for the city manager, Mr. Branstetter?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Caulfield, the map that you sent us that WashDOT sent out defining the alternative shared path route that used Tillicum, DuPont, and that, and their yellow line of that route stopped at the city boundary. That is that an indication that the funding that was intended for that path is only going to be used for that portion that is shown as a yellow line, and that there's not an opportunity for the city to access some of those funds for the costs on as the path enters the city along some roads that will need some upgrades to be have a shared use path along them?
So Councilmember Branstetter, that's to be determined first and foremost. The monies that are allocated for the shared use pass, I think totals about 16.8, 16.9 million. So if there is an opportunity for additional sharing of those monies to include in Lakewood, as you just said, WashDOT has, they haven't said it, but they seem open to that. And so that would be money that potentially could be brought forward as part of our, JBLM North Access project. But again, that's to be determined.
So, okay, thank you. And then in the letter from DSHS, in a previous session, we discussed that if DSHS put the community policing program within their budget, that we might not need to have it be the priority of a legislative priority in our agenda. But their letter doesn't say they're going to put it into their budget. They say that they anticipate there being another budget proviso. So does that mean we need to keep working legislatively to get that proviso in the budget, even though they're going to be okay with it? Or is this now a better process than in past years, or is it the same?
Councilmember Branstetter, I think it's a better process right now. I think we're in a better position than we have been in the past, because at this point in time, we're not needing to request our legislators to put it in the budget. That DSHS has it in there. And so what we're trying to do is just verify with, as close to 100% certainty as possible that it's going to not just be there in the governor's budget, but more importantly, it's not going to be subject to any kind of across the board cut. So at this point in time, we still have more feedback that we'd like to get from the governor's office, and particularly before we make a decision on whether or not this is something you would want to remove from your legislative priorities list. Given the fact that the state is going to be facing some budget holes, my recommendation based on what I know right now is to leave your legislative priorities as they are.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other questions? Then we'll move to council comments. Mr. Branstetter, why don't we just stay with you?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to attend the United Way sponsorship Pathways Out of Poverty annual event tomorrow. And see what new ideas or initiatives are circulating out there in the county, particularly around those folks who are working but not earning enough to do that. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of COVID nuances in that discussion, and whatever is significant would report back. I have to apologize. Earlier in this evening, I lost track of the flow of the conversation on the fee schedules, because I had intended to bring it up after we were done submitting questions to Ms. Kraus to the rest of the council about the fact that 2 years ago, we made a decision with the staff recommendation to not have a fee for being late with your rental housing safety program registration. At that time, the discussion was it's new. We're still trying to get voluntary compliance. We didn't want to put something in to do that. And so what we had is the only thing in the fee schedule was if you're late with registering, if you're up to a month late, there's no fee. But after that, there's also no fee. In other words, there isn't anything in the fee schedule that says if you are 6 months late or you never pay it, that there's not a fee to go on. And I am thinking that, the program is established enough and we have about an 80+% compliance with, at least in terms of the number of units that are being registered for the program, that to not have a fee assessed when we catch up with folks who don't register or don't re-register, and we have some of those, that we would be creating a situation of where we have, well, why do I want to be part of the 80% when I can be part of the 20%? So I exchanged a couple of emails with the city manager, and he had a suggestion that, like with other late fees, that we could put something in the fee schedule that says that the fee for being later than 30 days to re-register or registering when you're supposed to could be double the cost, which would be consistent with what happens with other late fees in other parts of, in other things of the city. And so, my suggestion is, and if I would refer you to the city manager's email back to me that he shared with all of you, is that ask that, that the late fee for rental housing registration for over 1 month be, as he mentioned there, be computed at 100% of the cost of the applicable fee. I just think now is a time to put that in to the fee schedule, to be sort of complete the program. I mean, the program is valuable, and I think though, but it only remains valuable if participation remains high, and at some point participation needs to be enforced as well. That concludes my comments, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I attended the Clover Park School District Board meeting this evening, and I was asked by the board to convey to the council and to the city that they are very thankful for the work that the council and the city has done. As to Mr. Brandstetter's comment about the fee schedule, I think it is reasonable, and I think we should discuss that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm good.
Mr. Volkey.
I'm fine, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Farmer.
I wanted to let everybody know that one of our trusted community partners, Rebuilding Hope, the Sexual Assault Center of Pierce County, is seeking new board members. Their mission is to offer support toward healing through advocacy and therapy for those affected by sexual assault and abuse. It's a 3-year term for their board. You do not have to be a survivor or have a particular connection to sexual assault in order to qualify to be on the board. Many of the current board members have a heart for serving this population. And for more information, you can go to sexualassaultcenter.com. And that's it for me.
Thanks. Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. Been a busy week. I just had one comment on the budget discussion tonight that was really more of a brief overview by Ms. Kraus and not much discussion by us, but I want to put my plug in for the EDB and their work plan. As we discussed some time ago, given the manager's recommendation that we not increase the EDB's anticipated budget for the city's contribution beyond 20,000 for 2021, but that the council consider upping it by 5,000 in the year 2022. So I throw that out there for discussion, not necessarily tonight, but when we get to the final council meeting where we're going to review, adopt, and chat about the budget. I want to make sure it's out there up front, as I told you all I would. Other than that, it's been an interesting week, and I'll just put a point of personal privilege here. I called my opponent in the county council election, Janie Hitchen, tonight and wished her well, congratulated her on a race well run. And I understand that our Senator Steve O'Bannon did likewise with his opponent tonight. And so, you know, we hear a lot about transitions of power at the national level, but here in our local level, we are blessed with good sense. And we look forward to, you know, embracing our new folks in leadership and wish them well and much success and all the help we can provide them along the way. There you go.
Thank you. Two items which were mentioned almost somewhat in passing tonight. One, the shared use path, basically bike pedestrian path, WashDOT has now targeted for redirection. I can speak to that a little bit more detail since I actually created the original map. JBLM didn't like it. We drew a map which was essentially a loop around JBLM that included going out Highway 7, hooking up with Thurston County, going the Yelm Roy trail route linkage, taking existing trail systems or non-motorized paths in different municipalities, linking them together, and it would be a real stretch to construct that with the funds that had been allocated by WashDOT, but since they were building 4 bridges, proposing to take out some military housing and doing all sorts of very expensive things down a 4-mile strip, I believe it was. It goes a lot farther if you're going through, say, down the mountain highway in a right of way that's essentially donated by JBLM. What has been selected is tentative, but it is something that is a linkage that's agreed on, I think, by all the parties that had input, and has been accepted by WashDOT. The big question is, will they want to keep the money? Because that section may only cost 1/3 of the money that was allocated to this. That's unknown at this point, but it certainly will cost less than was budgeted for the non-motorized path down I-5, much less. So the next step really before you put any additional ink on a map is to make sure you can keep the money so that you can then decide where it's going to be spent. With respect to SHAPE, the South Sound Housing Affordability Partnership, there are different levels of proposed funding and different levels of proposed staffing or manners of staffing and funding that have been discussed by the group. And so when that comes back, it's really how robust do you want this from an organizational standpoint? And then what is an appropriate contribution from participants? Because it's really truly meant to be a county-wide coalition so that you can do things cooperatively. And part of that doing things cooperatively is showing that we can work together, unlike some others, and going to Olympia and saying, us first, we have a project we think will work, or we have a process we think will work, and make us the poster child. So more to come on that. Is there anything else to come before the council? Well, then it will be adjourned, and I hope to see you next Monday, but there's always the possibility of connectivity problems when you're in a warm, humid environment.
Not on purpose.
The air quotes come out. Mhm. Sympathy? No.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.
And everyone.